Hey everyone. Tonight we're diving into one of the strangest royal stories of the medieval world. A world where girls were born from cousins who married each other. You'll meet them, chapter by chapter. They endured much and were remembered for little. We trace the line where power became decay. Royal blood folded back onto itself. These weren't fairy tales, but family strategies. What mattered most wasn't love, but lineage. Daughters were born not to choose, but to fulfill. Their destinies were planned before their first steps. It happened again and again, without shame. Aunts married nephews. Cousins birthed kings. Mothers raised their sons for broken thrones. Fathers arranged unions that blurred generations. The goal was always the same: control. Control of titles, control of bloodlines, control of what could never last. Some were born into silence. Others screamed, but only behind stone walls. Their portraits show calm eyes, painted grace, but those frames never spoke of grief. They were queens, but they were also victims. Of dynasty, of duty, of design. Their names echo through history books, but their truths lie buried under titles. These women came from palaces. They ate from silver, slept beneath gold. But nothing about their lives was soft. Their choices were illusions, wrapped in velvet. When you marry your cousin's son and give birth to your uncle's heir, you do not live freely. You exist. Existence becomes obligation. Obligation becomes silence, and silence becomes madness. Some were called mad. Too loud, too sad, too aware of what was happening, too unwilling to smile while bleeding quietly. Their minds were questioned, but never the system that crushed them. A system that chose blood over balance, titles over tenderness. Some ruled from convents. Some carried coffins across entire kingdoms. Some were buried beneath scandal. Others erased altogether. And still, they endured longer than expected. Their lives, though broken, changed the course of empires, not by design, but by survival. You may know their names. You may think you understand, but you have never heard them like this. One by one they return tonight, not to ask for pity, but to speak clearly, finally. We begin not with triumph, but with repetition. Names repeating, faces repeating, mistakes repeating. When your grandfather's is also your uncle, and your daughter marries her cousin's son, history starts to bend in strange ways. Some called it sacred tradition. Others knew better and stayed silent. Because to speak was to risk everything. So they smiled, knelt, obeyed, and died with their secrets. But their stories did not vanish. They lingered in court records, in letters between kings, in the strange shape of a jawline. Now, centuries later, we listen again. Not to gossip, not for scandal, but because truth matters, even in silence, even after so long. Tonight, we begin at the beginning, with one woman, one mother, one daughter of two powerful names. Born to serve an empire, but remembered for refusing to disappear. Her name was Juana, and her story does not begin with madness or mourning, but with a marriage contract. Signed before she turned 13, the others will follow. Some fierce, some fragile, some forgotten, some feared, but all part of the same root. The same tree looped endlessly, branch crossing branch, until light could no longer pass through. This is the story of that tree, of the women who grew inside it, and of what it cost them to stay. So let the room go still. Let the noise outside fall quiet. Let the stories speak. We begin now. Juana of Castile was born into great power, daughter of two sovereigns, Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain. She was their third child, born in 1479. A girl with deep eyes and a quiet mind. But her blood was loud, full of expectation. She came from the Trastamara line, tightly wound. Cousins married cousins for generations before her birth. It was seen as duty, not danger. She inherited titles, yes, but also a legacy of sorrow. And something else, the weight of her bloodline. As a child, she was curious and reserved. She studied Latin, theology, and courtly manners. Obedience was praised. Emotion was hidden. She learned quickly what silence could protect. At 16, she was sent to Flanders. Her husband-to-be, Philip the Handsome, Archduke, cousin, stranger. Their wedding was political, like everything else. Juana reportedly fell deeply in love, but Philip? He wandered, constantly, openly. His charm was for the public, not his wife. Juana's devotion became jealousy, sharp and spiraling. The court whispered. Her emotions made them uncomfortable. She did not behave like a proper queen. She wept. She questioned. She followed him in disguise. Some called it madness. Others, heartbreak. When Philip died suddenly, she collapsed inward. They said it was typhoid. She thought otherwise. She refused to bury him right away. She kept the coffin close, traveling beside it, opening it, praying to it, watching it decay. It horrified the court, delighted her enemies. They called her mad, unfit to rule. Her father Ferdinand took power in her name. Her son Charles would do the same later. Juana lived for decades locked in a convent, guarded, forgotten, officially incapable, quietly alive. She was still a queen, but not ruling. Her letters remained lucid, her words clear. She asked for freedom. It never came. Her grief was political, her sorrow convenient. A woman who weeps is easier to silence. They feared her will, not her mind. She was not mad. She was inconvenient. She had loved a man who betrayed her. She had trusted a father who confined her. And she had given birth to an emperor. Charles V, Holy Roman ruler, architect of Europe. He, too, kept her locked away. He visited rarely, spoke of duty, not warmth. But her presence helped justify his power. A throne can be steadied by sidelining a queen. Juana spent her final years in silence. Windows too high to see the world. Masses every day. Letters never answered, but she endured, she always did. Her story became legend, misunderstood, and reused. They called her Juana the Mad. But madness was the name history gave her pain. She loved fiercely and lost without mercy. She questioned what she was told to accept. She held her dead husband's hand longer than allowed. She refused to behave like a grieving widow. She became a ghost before her death. But she did not vanish. She became a warning, a symbol, a shadow. History carved her into something tragic. But she was never only that. She was a daughter, a mother, a queen, and more than anything, an echo of a broken world. Born into a line that feared emotion, raised in halls where love meant alliance, Juana tried to love anyway. She tried to choose, at least once, and the cost was a lifetime behind stone. They crowned her, but never let her reign. They dressed her in gold, then locked the door. She died in 1555, quietly in her cell. No fanfare, no farewell, just fading breath. Her story remained. Confused, conflicted, co-opted, but still hers, always hers. The story of a girl born royal, raised to obey, but born to feel. She did not go mad, she resisted, and that was enough to be forgotten. Now, centuries later, we say her name again. Juana of Castile, daughter of Spain, queen without a throne. Not mad, Not broken, just remembered too late. The coffin followed her across the land. Wooden, sealed, carried by loyal guards at night. It was not a symbol. It was him. She could not let Philip be buried. To bury him meant letting go too soon. They called it delusion, but it was love clinging to form. She rode beside it, watched it in silence. Villagers whispered. Priests avoided her eyes, but she would not let him go. Each stop, she checked the body. They say she opened the lid at dusk. They say she spoke to him gently. Others say she wept without making a sound. Truth and rumor tangled around her name. Juana the Mad. Juana the Widow. Juana the Obstacle. Everyone had their version of her story. Ferdinand, her father, took swift control. He called the council. He spoke of duty. He declared Juana unfit to rule Castile. He locked her away, for her own good. The convent became her new palace, but the gates did not open again. She was queen only in title now. No court, no council, no decisions to make. The walls were high and cold, the nuns kind, but always distant. Juana prayed. She fasted. She sat in stillness. Seasons passed without visitors. Years passed without freedom. Her children were taken from her arms. They were raised by others, taught to forget. She wrote letters. Some were sent, most were intercepted, most never answered. Still, she remembered each child by name. Charles, her son, grew into a monarch. He wore the crown she once held. But he never freed her from the cell. He used her name. He claimed her blood. But he did not look into her eyes. Not for long. Not with honesty. He needed her locked away, as his father had before him. A grieving woman frightened powerful men. A woman who remembered frightened them more. She had seen betrayal too closely. She had lived beside its breath, and she had not gone silent enough. So they called it madness. What they could not erase, they renamed. But Juana remembered everything. She remembered the court of Flanders, the night her husband didn't return. The way her father touched her arm as he whispered orders to the guards. She remembered her mother's face, hard and distant on the throne. She remembered the bloodlines, the marriages, the contracts she signed with trembling hands. She had always obeyed, even when it tore her heart. But obedience never bought her freedom, only tighter chains, sewn in silk. Even locked away, she listened. Rumors reached her through servants and whispers. Wars, treaties, deaths, betrayals, and none of them surprised her anymore. The world outside kept moving, but Juana remained in that still room. A candle, a cross, a memory, and the weight of what might have been. They let her walk the courtyard sometimes, always watched, always measured. She spoke little, but her eyes still burned. She had not forgotten who she was. The crown was gone, but not the dignity beneath it. She was never loud, but silence can be sharper than speech. She read scriptures late at night. She prayed for her children, even those who never prayed for her. The court called her finished, but history was not done with her yet. Pain does not vanish when it's ignored. It settles. Deep, permanent, generational. Charles ruled an empire, but it was her blood in his veins, her sorrow in his shadow, her silence beneath his throne. Juana never tried to escape. She had nowhere left to go, not back to childhood, not to Philip, not to a world that feared her, but she endured. Quietly, without spectacle, year by year, cold morning by cold morning. No rebellion, no violence, just presence. Sometimes survival is its own defiance. Sometimes not vanishing is enough. When Charles came to visit, he was guarded. She greeted him calmly, asked about his health, spoke of scripture, then fell quiet. He left quickly. He never stayed long. Perhaps her eyes unsettled him, eyes that remembered too much. She aged. Slowly, painfully. Teeth gone, hair thinned, back bent. But her memory remained untouched. She could name every betrayal, every promise broken in God's name, every moment someone else spoke for her. But she never screamed, not once. She did not give them that. When she fell ill in winter, no one came to her side. A nun held her hand. The candle flickered, and she was gone. They buried her simply. No public mourning, no royal display, just a stone, a name, a year. But she was not forgotten. Whispers of her survived the empire. And in time, people asked again, was she truly mad, or simply too human to fit the throne? Juana of Castile, a queen in name, a prisoner in truth, a woman who dared to grieve when grief was not allowed. Not mad, not weak, just deeply, unbearably alive. They said she stopped speaking for days, not from madness, but from exhaustion. Words had been taken from her slowly, one by one, through loss and lies. She once spoke many languages: Latin, Castilian, French, and the tongue of court. But inside those walls, only silence mattered. The words she kept were prayers. The rest she buried to survive. In youth, her voice had stirred rooms, sharp, controlled, beautiful, entirely hers. But even that was taken. Her voice was rewritten by others, chroniclers, ambassadors, priests who never met her. They shaped her into myth, then blamed her for not fitting it. Outside, empires grew. Borders changed. Inside, Juana walked 12 paces east, then 12 paces west. The rhythm became a map of control, each step a memory, worn into stone. Here, Philip had smiled. There, Charles had cried. Elsewhere, she had stood alone, again. She counted hours by shadows, seasons by the cold beneath her door. News came in fragments, barely explained, sometimes whispered through keyholes by nervous hands. Once, a guard told her Spain had won. She nodded, but asked nothing more. Victory was nothing new, nor was loss. The convent chapel echoed on feast days. She knelt behind the others, head bowed. But her thoughts drifted far beyond ritual. She remembered Castile in spring. The wind across empty fields, the scent of almond bark and dust. No one in the convent asked questions. They had been told she was unstable, but some suspected more. The servants who brought her food noted how carefully she arranged each plate, how she placed the cup exactly centered, how she ate slowly, deliberately, always in silence. They watched her fold linens with precision, saw her touch her rosary like a relic. She was not lost. She was simply waiting. Waiting for release, for forgiveness, for something no longer coming. And yet she endured. Not with rage, with resolve. The stillness of someone who has seen enough. Her daughters had long been married off. To kings, to dukes, to distant lands. She heard nothing of them anymore. Her name no longer passed their lips. But Charles remained tied to her. Through blood, through crown, through necessity. He needed her locked away, as proof that he ruled alone. Still, he could not erase her entirely. She lived too long, outlasted advisors, outlasted wars. She became part of the stone. One year, a letter reached her hands. No seal, no title, just 3 lines, written in a trembling hand. I remember your voice. I remember your singing. I remember you, Mother. She folded the letter slowly, placed it beneath her pillow, and never spoke of it again. Sometimes at night she hummed, low, fragile, from memory alone. Not a song of sorrow, a lullaby, almost forgotten. The nuns listened. Some wept quietly. None dared join in. There were nights the wind howled. She would rise from bed, stand before the shuttered window, and whisper words no one else knew. Words from another life, a life with light and music and the illusion of choice. She had learned early that crowns weigh differently on daughters. Heavier, quieter, closer to the bone. They taught her to rule, but not to feel. They taught her obedience, but not what to do with pain. Juana knew more than she showed. She understood what had been done. To her. Through her. Because of her. And yet she cursed no one. She named no traitors. She kept their secrets with dignity. There was strength in that silence, a kind of royalty beyond gold. One day, the old priest came. He had served her family long ago. Now frail, bent by years, he asked to hear her voice again. She looked at him a long time, then recited the Lord's Prayer in Latin. Slow, clear, perfectly paced. He wept, not for her madness, but for the clarity she still carried. She was not lost. She had never been. When the fever came, she did not fight it. She accepted the sweat, the cold shaking, the soft hands that folded cloth. She did not speak in those days, but her eyes remained alert, watching, measuring, listening still. They say she passed at dawn, the room full of pale light, her hands folded, her face calm. No grand procession followed. No bells rang for the queen, just a simple burial, and a name carved in stone. Juana, daughter of Catholic monarchs, mother of emperors, queen without voice, queen without crown, but not without legacy, not without fire, not without witness. History tried to forget her, to box her inside madness, to explain her away, but she endured too long. And now we remember, not as they described her, but as she truly was, still, unbroken. A woman surrounded by walls, but never small inside them. Her life was a mirror, held up to power, and power looked away. But we do not. We listen now. And her voice, once stolen, rises again. They said she died peacefully in her cell. No crown, no court, no ceremony, just silence. A queen forgotten by her own kingdom. But death was not her ending. Her story stretched far beyond that day. It lingered in whispers, in portraits, in names. History tried to reduce her to madness, but those who listened closely heard something deeper. Juana had not vanished. She had become a mirror, a reflection of what power demands from women, and what it destroys to keep control. She was born into strategy, raised inside protocol, married by order, buried by fear. Each part of her life was shaped by someone else's need. A daughter, when heirs were required. A bride, when alliances were fragile. A mother, when lineage had to survive. But never once was she asked what she wanted. Never once did anyone pause to wonder if her silence meant suffering, or her weeping meant truth. They only asked, is she obedient? Is she useful? Is she still controllable? When the answers changed, so did their treatment of her. They called her unstable because she loved too deeply. They called her dangerous because she remembered too clearly. They called her mad because they needed her to disappear. But Juana never surrendered to their version. She survived it. She lived inside it. She watched them rewrite her and stayed intact beneath the edits. The years wore on. The world outside shifted. New monarchs ruled. New wars broke. But her name never faded completely. Travelers spoke of a woman in a tower, a queen who walked in straight lines, a widow who prayed without stopping. Some came to see her, diplomats, priests, even her grandchildren. Most left disturbed. They expected a ghost, but found a woman still present. She did not rant. She did not beg. She did not scream. She watched them and remained herself. There was clarity in her eyes, a depth most could not meet. They wanted madness. She gave them memory. Inside her rooms, she kept few things: a carved wooden cross, a worn psalter, a folded letter yellowed with time. She touched it each morning, never opened it, but always knew it was there. It reminded her of a child's voice, one that had once called her mother, before he became emperor, before he forgot her name in public. Juana never asked for much, not for revenge, not for restoration, only for dignity, for the right to be real again. And even that was denied, because real women complicate official narratives. Real women grieve, refuse, resist. Remember, and history prefers queens who smile softly in paintings, who die quietly in footnotes, who never speak from behind their portraits. But Juana's silence was never empty. It was full of everything unsaid, full of grief that had no place, full of truth that frightened kings. After her death, her story scattered across Europe. Some called her cursed, others called her saintly. Few called her human, but in secret places women whispered her name differently, not with pity, but with recognition, because they too had been silenced. They too had walked hallways alone. They too had carried what no one saw. Juana became a shadow in the archives, a question scribbled in the margins, a name that would not behave. And slowly, over generations, the questions returned. Was she truly unwell? Or merely unwilling to pretend? Was her sorrow a sickness? Or simply too visible to ignore? What does it mean to be born royal but denied the right to feel? Juana asked all these things, not aloud, but by existing when they tried to erase her. The nuns remembered her gentleness. The guards remembered her stillness. The scribes remembered her careful letters. And the stone remembered her steps. She left no memoir, but every inch of her prison bore witness to the shape of her life. A life not wasted, but quietly withheld. A reign that never began, but never truly ended. Because power does not always roar. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it endures. Sometimes it survives by being still. And sometimes that is enough. Juana of Castile did not disappear. She waited for the world to finally look again. And now, centuries later, we do. We see her not as legend, but as woman. Not as failure, but as mirror. Not as mad, but as unbearably clear. She never saw her own tomb, but she had imagined it many times. Not out of vanity, only preparation. She knew her place in history would not be written by her hands. Stone would speak where she could not. Cold, carved names in silence beneath altars. No voice, no story, just a title. Queen of Castile, daughter of Spain, madwoman of legend, woman of grief. But Juana's mind was always her own, even as others claimed it lost. She remembered every betrayal clearly. She carried truth where no one looked. Time passed behind locked gates. Her world narrowed to chambers and corridors. But within that stillness, she expanded inward. Memory became her kingdom. She ruled over moments no one else held. A laugh in Flanders before the wedding. A whisper from her sister in childhood. The weight of Philip's head on her shoulder. Each memory sharpened over time. She did not let them dull. To forget was to vanish, and she refused to disappear. She kept her body upright for years, even when her joints screamed, even when the cold refused to leave. Some nights she could not sleep, not from fear, but from clarity. The mind turns louder in solitude. She prayed to remember, not just God, but herself. The woman beneath the veil. She knew what they said, that she was unfit, unnatural, unstable, that she wept too often, that her love had no measure. But those who called her mad had never lost what she had never watched a kingdom use a coffin to erase a queen. They said a proper woman lets go. Juana held on. That was her crime. She loved beyond policy, beyond protocol, beyond comfort. And history punished her for that, not with death, but with distortion, turning her into symbol, not self. She had lived in castles. Now she lived in shadow. But she did not forget the light. Sometimes at dawn, she stood outside, the sky just beginning to break. She lifted her face to it, not to pray, just to witness. Even the sun had never abandoned her. Even the light remembered her skin. The nuns who watched her aged slowly. They came and went, replacing each other in silence. But she remained, the queen who never left. Some feared her, not because of rage, but because she saw too much. She looked through people, as if she could read what they tried to hide. Her eyes became legend among them. "Don't look too long," they whispered. "She remembers everything." And she did. Down to the taste of winter pears, down to the softness of her child's hair, down to the echo of steps that once left and never returned. Charles, her son, grew into myth. Holy Roman Emperor, Lord of the world. But Juana had known him first, barefoot in a nursery, cradled in arms that would later lose him. He owed her everything, and offered nothing in return. But still she prayed for him, not out of duty, but longing. She did not hate, even when hatred might have made sense. She chose stillness instead, not as surrender, but as defiance no one understood, because they expected a queen to rule or fall, but not to wait, not to remain, and yet she did. For years beyond counting. She outlived her mother, her sisters, her betrayers, even many who had once guarded her. Time became her ally, not because it healed her, but because it proved her real. No one endures fiction for so long. Only truth holds this kind of weight. In her final decade, she spoke less. Not out of confusion, but out of choice. She had said all she could. The rest belonged to memory now. To those who would one day listen and ask, what truly happened here? What did they take from her? What did she hold on to? She had answers, but not in words. They lived in posture, in gaze, in the way she refused to fade. And when her body finally failed, her story did not. It passed from mouth to mouth, through marble halls and village corners, across centuries and empires. Changing, fading, returning again. Each time someone asked about Juana, something stirred in the air, because some names never vanish. They linger. They ask to be seen, not just read. Juana of Castile was one such name. Written in dust, pressed into silence, burned into lineage, not as a queen crowned in glory, but as a woman who remembered, and would not let the world forget. She was born into the age of faith, but she learned early not to trust it. Faith in men, faith in crowns, even faith in God sometimes cracked. Juana had watched saints carved in stone crumble after long winters in Castile. If stone could break, so could women. But some refused. She was one of them. She was. She had never knelt for comfort, only for discipline, only when others were watching. Her prayers became private, between her and silence, between her and what remained. Once, she had believed the world had meaning, that marriages were sacred, that sons were loyal, that queens were more than signatures on parchment. But time peeled those illusions back, layer by layer, until all that remained was the shape of herself, worn but intact. They had tried to mold her, tried to soften her with solitude, but solitude sharpened her instead. She became a blade inside quietness. Not to harm, but to cut through falsehood. Even locked away, she stayed watching. Not physically, through memory, through instinct. She knew when things shifted outside. A war won too quickly. A rumor silenced too neatly. A servant trembling without reason. Juana did not ask. She simply observed. And sometimes observation is enough. The power of knowing remained hers, even when all else was taken. Her chamber was plain. Stone, wood, A single narrow bed, a table worn by decades of hands, a cross above the door, uneven, slightly tilted. That was her kingdom now. Not vast, but real. She knew every corner, every knot in the wood. She had memorized the cracks in the wall, the way light fell on certain days. That small room held her entire world. And yet she held more inside her. Dreams that never faded, faces that never aged, questions no one had answered. She had not spoken Philip's name for years, but he remained, not as memory, as presence. The shape of his back when he left, the sound of his voice turning cold, the way he looked at other women even on the day of their vows. She had loved him anyway. Even when it poisoned her, even when it tore her open, they had mocked her grief, called it obsession. But what is love? When the world refuses to recognize it, it becomes hunger, it becomes ache, it becomes legend, and legends are always rewritten. They preferred the version where she chased a coffin in madness, not the one where she followed him in mourning. They preferred the silence of a woman who broke, not the voice of a woman who endured. But Juana had no use for preference. She had lived the truth. She had tasted the bitter wine. She no longer waited for redemption, only remembrance. Not for glory, but for honesty. She had been queen in name longer than most had lived, but her power was buried with her voice. Still, she left traces behind, in letters smuggled through cloisters, in the shape of her son's doubt, in the quiet rebellion of her stillness. The guards spoke of her often. Some feared her, others pitied, a few respected. One said, "She does not age like we do. She's part of the stones now." And perhaps she was, not vanished, but absorbed, into the walls, into the legend, into the waiting. She watched her own myth grow. Mad Juana, the queen who would not let go. But she knew herself by another name, the name her mother once whispered, before distance chilled the words between them. Juana, not mad, not lost, just unwilling to pretend. She was not the only one. Other women had broken quietly. Some had screamed. Others had faded. But Juana stood still. And that too was rebellion. There is power in remaining visible, even when no one looks at you. There is strength in breathing when the world expects collapse. She had nothing left to prove, but she remained a presence behind curtains, a question behind every crowned heir. What had it cost her? What had they taken? And what, in all their violence, had they failed to destroy? That answer lived in her stillness, in her eyes, in the soft pressure of her fingertips, on a wooden table each morning. No document recorded those things, but they were real as empire, more enduring than titles, more lasting than rule, because history forgets queens, but remembers women who will not be rewritten. And Juana of Castile could not be changed, could not be reshaped, could not be made into something polite. She was truth in its most inconvenient form, and truth endures. She once stood beneath cathedral arches, crowned in gold. Now she rose in silence with the bells, not as queen, but as one more shadow among many cloistered behind the convent's gates. Each morning began with cold water, rough cloth, and prayer spoken without urgency. She did not rush the rituals. They gave her shape, they gave her rhythm, the others around her moved with discipline, but Juana moved with something else. Memory. Every step she took led somewhere old, somewhere the others could not follow. She lived in two worlds, one present, gray and predictable, the other vivid, warm, and gone. In that second world, her children still ran barefoot through marble halls. Philip smiled, if only for a moment. Her mother's voice carried warmth instead of rule. She never confused dream with reality, but she refused to forget either. And so, both stayed with her, side by side, every hour. The nuns treated her with respect, but also with caution. They had been warned of her temper, though none had truly seen it. What they saw instead was someone who rarely raised her voice, someone who listened more than she spoke, someone who always looked beyond them, toward something they could not name. They never asked what she saw. Perhaps they feared the answer. She did not correct their assumptions. Let them think what they needed. It was easier that way. Inside her, the fire burned slowly, not rage, not madness, just clarity, long denied a voice. Clarity has its own heat, its own hunger, its own weight. She carried it with grace, but it pressed on her shoulders more than any crown ever had. The crown had been taken, but the burden remained. She did not forget what it meant to be born for others, to belong to alliances, to be traded across borders in silks. She had once been a bride, wrapped in lace and dread, handed to a stranger with a kingdom, and she had loved him, despite reason, despite cruelty, despite betrayal dressed in perfume. Because love, for her, was not logic. It was loyalty to what once felt real, and even that was taken from her, turned into evidence of instability. She had mourned, deeply, without permission, and they called it unfit. She had followed a coffin across provinces, and they called it grotesque. She had spoken of visions in sleep, and they called it delusion. Yet none of them had asked what it meant to carry so much and be believed by no one. So she stopped asking. She stopped explaining. She folded her grief into the fabric of her daily life, a queen in quiet exile. Some queens wear robes. Juana wore patience. Some ruled with decrees. She ruled with presence. That was her final kingdom. The small world she refused to abandon. She tended a tiny garden once. Allowed by the abbess, she pulled weeds with bare hands. The earth did not fear her. The earth did not rewrite her name. She planted rosemary, and when it bloomed, she touched it like something holy. One nun asked her why that herb. She replied, without smiling, "For remembrance." The girl did not understand, but Juana did not explain. There are truths too full for speech, too personal for interpretation. And Juana had long since stopped handing over her truths to others. She remained vigilant until the end. Not paranoid, just watchful, like someone who knows that peace is always temporary. And perhaps for her, it was. Even sleep brought no full rest. Only flickers of childhood, flashes of faces gone. And sometimes, the weight of a crown settling again on a head already bowed. But still she rose, every morning, without fail. She dressed slowly, brushed her hair herself, laid out her shoes with care. There was pride in those movements, not vanity, discipline, a refusal to let them take even that. The guards changed, the nuns aged, the seasons turned. But Juana's rhythm held steady, because some queens do not fall. They do not shatter. They simply endure. And in that endurance, they reveal something terrifying, that dignity cannot be caged, that silence is not defeat, that the soul of a woman cannot be erased by decree, by isolation, or by centuries of convenient myth. Juana knew she would be misunderstood. But she also knew that truth outlasts misunderstanding. The truth was, she had loved, she had lost, she had suffered, and she had not disappeared. That was enough. More than enough. And so she lived, day by day, with grace unrecognized and strength unthanked, until time at last came softly, not as punishment but as release, and the walls she knew finally let go of her name. Time did not forget her completely. It simply placed her in the shadows, between chapters, between rulers, between the lines. But Juana had lived fully in silence, and silence remembers what speeches often erase. The years passed in quiet succession. Candles burned down. Generations changed thrones. But her name remained on the ledgers. Still Queen of Castile. Still confined. Even in absence, she held position. Even unseen, she was never unimportant. The world beyond her walls grew faster than she could imagine. Maps redrawn. Faith splintered. Ships sailed west and never returned. But in Tordesillas, nothing changed. The same stone, The same breath, the same sky through narrow slits. She did not envy the world outside. She had known it too well, and too painfully. It had taken her name and used it against her, twisted her loyalty into affliction, her grief into spectacle, her motherhood into politics. So she stayed behind the walls, not by choice, but with intention. To survive, sometimes one must disappear, not from the world, but from its expectations. She grew older with grace uncelebrated. Her back curved like an old bow, but her eyes remained sharp, alert. Each wrinkle told a truth unspoken. Each gesture carried a quiet defiance. She had not broken. She had simply endured longer than those who tried to break her. One morning, a letter arrived, carried by a trembling hand, sealed in wax. No crest. She stared at it for hours before opening it with slow care. Inside, only a sentence. 5 words written in Latin. Tu regina es et eris. You are queen, and you will be. There was no signature, no explanation, only the knowing. She placed it beside the older letter, the one from years ago, signed only by a child's uncertain hand. They sat together now. 2 fragments, one from the past, one from the future. She asked no one who sent it. Some things are better unnamed, but she smiled, just once, and that was enough. That smile was not joy. It was recognition of who she had been, of who she still was, of who she would always remain. Her footsteps grew slower in winter. The cold reached into her joints. Her fingers stiffened when she prayed. But still, she folded her hands each night, not for deliverance, only for remembering. Prayer was memory for her now. Each word linked to something lived. Each line drawn from her own story. The guards who watched her did not understand what they witnessed. A woman too still to fear, too silent to punish. But presence can be its own rebellion, and hers had never faded. One day, a bird flew into her chamber. Through an open shutter, by accident. It beat against the glass in panic. She rose without sound, walked slowly toward it, and opened the latch. It sat stunned for a moment, then flew out without a sound. She watched it go, then turned back to her chair. She did not speak of it, but the nuns remembered. They wrote it down in their journals. Some called it a sign, but Juana already knew what it meant to be caged and what it meant to fly. She had not flown, but she had not died in spirit, and that perhaps was enough. Her hair turned fully white. Her steps became shorter, her words fewer, but her silence grew louder. Louder than speeches, louder than decrees, louder than history. When news of Charles reached her, victories, defeats, politics, she nodded once, never more. He had taken the world in hand, but left his mother behind. That too was a kind of legacy. She bore it without resentment, not from forgiveness, but from understanding. Power forgets, and power fears what it cannot own. She had been both daughter and threat, both vessel and storm, too royal to remove, too human to trust. And so she had become stone, but living stone. Quiet, present, unmovable in purpose. Each day she rose with care, folded her shawl, lit her candle, as if to say, I remain, you have not erased me. And they hadn't. No matter how many years passed, no matter how many kings came after, Juana still breathed. And in that breath lived everything they tried to silence. She never asked for pity, only truth. Only to be seen as she was. Not mad, not perfect, just remembered. And she was, by the stones, by the air, by the pages that refused to burn. Juana of Castile. Queen by blood. Captive by force. Witness by choice. Still walking. Still listening. Still enduring. There were days when no one spoke. Not out of rule, but rhythm. The silence grew familiar over time. Not empty, just full of what was unsaid. Juana had learned that silence reveals much. Who listens? Who waits? Who endures? And she had become a master of it. She did not need permission to be still. Stillness had become her language, her crown. No throne beneath her feet, but presence that could not be stolen. The world outside measured kings by conquest. But inside her stone cell, power was measured by memory. She remembered more than anyone suspected. The exact shade of Philip's cloak, the sound of her mother's farewell breath, the first lie she believed in court. Memory became her inheritance, unwritten, unspoken, undeniable. Some memories stung when touched, others comforted like soft light. But all of them remained hers, even when everything else had been stripped. She held her own mind like a relic, polished daily, protected fiercely. They never broke her. They only taught her patience. Even in confinement, she made choices. What to speak, what to bury, what to remember longer than pain. She rarely cried anymore. Tears had lost their shape. Grief became something different with age, not sharper, but heavier. A stone beneath every breath. She carried it like a queen, not because it was noble, but because she had no choice. To cast it off would mean forgetting, and she refused to forget. She had watched the world rewrite itself. Fathers dying, sons crowned, borders moving like tides, languages shifting with each generation. But her name remained, still listed on royal records, still called queen, though never allowed. The irony never escaped her, declared unfit to rule, yet necessary to legitimize the rulers. They needed her title, but feared her voice. So they kept the name and silenced the woman. That was how power worked. It adorned what it could not contain. Once, a new confessor was sent. Young, uncertain, trained in royal doctrine. He approached her carefully, unsure of the legend before him. "Do you wish to confess?" he asked. She looked at him slowly, then answered, "I remember too much to confess." He said nothing after that. Just listened as she breathed. She did not hate him. He had not earned it. He was another boy sent to translate a language he'd never learn. Her truths were not sins. They were sorrows. And sorrow is not a crime. She did not fear judgment. She had lived through worse. She feared only erasure, the slow dismantling of her meaning. That frightened her more than chains. Because when history forgets a woman, it does not just erase her name. It erases her defiance, her questions, her survival. And Juana had survived more than most. Love that betrayed, power that confined, faith that turned its face. And still she stood. Still she remembered. Still she remained. The winter of her final years was harsh. Frost entered the walls. Her hands ached with each prayer. But she welcomed the cold. It reminded her that she was alive. That feeling was still possible. She would press her palm against the stone wall beside her bed and whisper names she had not spoken in decades. Not to call them back, only to honor them. Names of sisters, of children, of who she had once been. She was no longer the girl with wide eyes and trembling hands. She was not the bride, not the widow, not even the prisoner. She was simply Juana, and being Juana was enough. Not a symbol, not a vessel, not a mistake, but a soul that endured. Some evenings, a servant would bring her figs. She would eat them slowly, tasting everything, as if it were the last sweetness on earth. She believed in savoring, even small things, especially small things, because life, in the end, is not measured in thrones or titles, but in what we choose to notice. A fig, a breeze, a memory that refuses to fade. She did not ask for more. She had asked once, long ago, and silence had answered. So now she simply received what little life still offered. And that made her freer than most. They spoke less about her in court. The legend began to settle, like dust on forgotten portraits, but not completely. She remained, somewhere between rumor and reverence. Not a ghost, not a myth, but a reminder. That power cannot erase pain. And silence does not mean defeat. That queens may be caged, but not contained. Juana of Castile, daughter of Spain, mother of emperors, watcher of years. She still walked her narrow room, head high, steps slow, carrying more history in her hands than the men who once crowned her. No bells rang when she was born. No stars fell. No prophecies declared her fate. Yet from the moment she cried, history began shaping its tools. She had not asked for legacy. It was placed on her shoulders like cloth, woven tight, heavy, royal. As a girl, she had believed that thrones came with certainty and light, but now she knew better. Thrones were built from compromise, and crowns from silence, not gold. The silence was always loudest at night, when even the wind held its breath. She would lie awake, eyes wide, listening to the crackle of memory. It never slept. It never stopped calling. Some memories came gently. The smell of her mother's hair. The laughter of a sister across marble floors. Others came like blades. The cold touch of a coffin. The sound of a door closing behind her. She had learned not to chase them, only to let them pass, like weather across an endless plain. Pain, too, had seasons. It came and went in waves, but always returned, reshaped, refined, and in time she accepted it. Not as punishment, as presence. She lived with it as one might live with breath. Never gone, rarely spoken, always there. She had long stopped asking, why me? There was no answer worth the question. Royal blood had its own price, and Juana had paid more than most. She had given her body to marriage, her womb to empire, her voice to silence, and still she remained. Others would have vanished, lost themselves in grief or madness. But Juana had become stillness, not from fear, from choice. Stillness let her see clearly. Stillness let her remember with precision. And memory was her final power. No court could strip it. No priest could absolve it. No son could rewrite it. She remembered how Philip looked when he thought she wasn't watching, how his smile shifted when she became inconvenient. She remembered the smell of the chambers where they told her he was dead, how the floor felt beneath her knees, how no one held her hand. They called her mad for mourning, but they never questioned the cruelty that followed her grief like a shadow. They wrote books about her, tales of wild obsession and delusion, but none spoke of the silence that followed each betrayal. And so she built her own history, not in ink, but in gaze, in breath, in waiting. Each time she rose, she added a line. Each day she endured, she sharpened the truth. She did not need an audience. The stones were enough. The air, the God she spoke to in whispers. Faith had become something quiet. No longer spectacle, no longer fear, just presence. She no longer prayed for freedom, only for clarity. She did not wish to be remembered as saint or sovereign, only as someone who did not vanish. And she hadn't, even now. She remained in fragments of memory across the land, in the worn names of convent ledgers, in the uncertain lines of portraits painted from rumor, not sight. Even in forgetting, she persisted, a whisper in the pages of history that would not be silenced. One winter, snow fell thick, thicker than any year before. The walls froze, the air turned to stone. Servants wore gloves inside their duties, but Juana sat bare-handed by the fire. She watched the flames as if they were speaking, as if they remembered, too. The abbess asked if she was cold. She replied, "Not anymore." The older she grew, the more the fire inside her stayed. It did not warm, it did not burn, it simply endured. She no longer feared the end. Death had become not a threat, but a return, not to paradise, but to wholeness, to everything taken, to the name before the noise. Juana. Without title, without chains, just the girl who once stood in a sunlit field, barefoot, holding a book she could not yet read. That girl still lived inside her, untouched by shame, unbroken by kings, and when her last breath came, it came without spectacle, just a soft sigh, like the end of a prayer. The nun who sat beside her said she did not tremble, did not clutch, only closed her eyes as if sleep had finally become safe again. There were no parades, no mourning banners, but something shifted in the walls, as if the air itself acknowledged her passing. The queen who had never ruled, the woman they could not erase. Juana of Castile had gone quiet at last, but never empty, never erased, never lost. And somewhere beyond time, she was still walking, barefoot, unburdened, free. They buried her without a procession. No trumpets, no mourning drapes on towers, no grand cathedral filled with courtiers and bishops. Just a body, wrapped in cloth, laid into silence. The queen who never ruled returned to the soil she was born from. And yet she remained, not beneath the ground, but in the uneasy breath of those who spoke her name. Juana was not erased by burial. Death only gave her story space to grow. They had tried to define her in life, mad, obsessed, unfit, but in death, the lines blurred. Who was she really? What did she see that others refused? What did she hold that terrified kings? She was no longer there to answer, but her absence spoke louder than presence. Across Castile, whispers returned. Not loud, but steady. Not reverent, but curious. People remembered this queen who lived behind walls. The woman who walked barefoot in gardens. The widow who prayed to her memories. Folk songs carried pieces of her story, some gentle, some cruel, all incomplete. A woman alone becomes a myth. A queen alone becomes a mirror. And Juana became both. They painted her long after death, not from life, but from imagination. Always in silence, always alone. Sometimes her eyes were wide with grief. Other times, cold with stillness. Never smiling. Always watching. Each brushstroke added distance, each retelling another wall. But still, her truth stirred beneath it all, like embers under ash. Waiting. Watching. She had been called a prisoner. But history is full of prisons. Some built of stone, some built of expectation. Juana had lived inside both, and still she had survived. Her son, Charles, ruled over empires, crossed oceans, commanded armies, named cities after saints. And yet he could not name his mother without hesitation. Her presence haunted his legacy, not as shame, but as shadow. He had locked her away to secure his crown, but nothing stays locked forever. Even the forgotten rise again. If not in power, then in truth. Juana's truth could not be undone, because it had no interest in triumph, only in being seen clearly without adornment. She was not a saint, she was not a martyr. She was a woman who had loved too fiercely, grieved too openly, and endured too long for comfort. The world had not known how to carry her, so it laid her down instead. But truth has long roots, and Juana's had grown deep, through soil, through silence, through the pages of the very books that once ignored her. In time, scholars returned to her name, not to fix her, but to find her. And what they found was not madness, not disorder, but clarity, misunderstood, feared, silenced. Juana had asked the wrong questions. She had loved without calculation. She had mourned without end. And those things in royal courts are dangerous. What if grief is not weakness? What if silence is not madness? What if presence, without permission, is power? Juana carried all those answers. She lived them, breathed them, waited with them, for the world to catch up. And slowly the world began to listen. In footnotes, in margins, in the tremble of historians, unwilling to call her mad too quickly. They looked again at the woman behind the myth, and found not a ghost, but a mirror. Juana had not vanished. She had simply waited. And waiting, too, is a form of strength. Her story did not belong to kings or priests. It belonged to those who have endured without recognition, to women who have been silenced, dismissed, buried under other people's versions, to those who held their breath rather than scream. Juana was never alone in her story. She stood among many, past, present, living, forgotten. And because she stood, others began to rise. Not in revolt, but in remembrance, a different kind of justice, one not written in law, but in acknowledgement. She had lived too long with no one listening. Now, finally, the world turned its head, and in that turning, a single truth emerged. That queens are not made by crowns. They are made by memory, by defiance, by breath held across centuries. Juana of Castile, queen behind walls, widow of betrayal, mother of empire, keeper of her own name. She was not broken. She was not mad. She was remembered. And that, at last, was enough. They thought her story would end in dust, folded beneath centuries, sealed in royal forgetting. But Juana's presence refused such quiet burial. She did not rise through rebellion or revenge. She rose through remembering, through what memory holds sacred. In libraries, her name was whispered again. In distant universities, scholars touched old letters, their fingers pausing over ink she once pressed. They searched for a woman behind the queen, a voice behind the silence that endured centuries. What they found was not myth, not madness, but a woman written over, trimmed and reshaped. Not erased entirely, but softened into convenience. Juana had once spoken too clearly, they said. She had loved too visibly, mourned too deeply. These were traits not suited to thrones, not suited to the cold calculations of power. And so, they bound her in shadows and labels. They locked her behind doors of narrative and fear. But over time, the locks grew rusted. And the key, long lost, was found again. Historians revisited the chronicles with careful care. They asked, who wrote these lines, and why? Who decided she was mad, and when? Every question became a crack in the stone. And through those cracks, Juana breathed again. She did not ask to be celebrated, only seen with eyes that no longer flinched. For even truth, long ignored, will return home. Even a name buried deep can rise anew. Women across centuries felt her story echo. Those who had wept in private, unheard. Those told their voices made them dangerous. Those praised only when they remained silent. They found something familiar in Juana's gaze, in her refusal to be reshaped or forgotten. She became not a relic, but a reflection. Not a lesson, but a warning and witness. In her confinement, she had not begged. She had not begged when widowed, nor dethroned. She had only continued to breathe, to witness. That in itself became a radical act, to remain human where others became symbols. They painted her again, but differently this time. No longer pale with madness, nor crowned falsely. Instead, she stood without jewels, without veil, head unbowed, hands folded over folded letters. Her gaze not vacant, but watching with clarity. A woman seen at last in full, not because time forgave her grief, but because time began to understand it. They spoke now of her resilience, of how she endured the long forgetting, of how she made the silence ring loud. No longer a cautionary tale, she became a testimony of survival. A letter discovered in a hidden archive bore her final signature, small but steady. The ink had not faded, though centuries had passed. It read simply, I am not gone. Not queenly, not poetic, just true, and sometimes truth needs no ornament. Her son's line would stretch through generations. Kings, emperors, conquerors bearing her blood, but few would speak her name aloud. Fewer still would carry her legacy honestly. For Juana did not rule with decree. She ruled with memory, with endurance, with breath. Her legacy was not palaces, but presence. And presence, though unseen, changes everything. They said she walked the halls at night, not as ghost, but as reminder. Not haunting, but observing what remained. The nuns who once feared her eyes had since become her silent chroniclers. Their notes survived, scattered in cloisters and vaults. They described her gentleness in old age, the way she blessed children with trembling fingers, the way she whispered to the plants she grew. They wrote of her patience, her restraint, how she never raised her voice, even when injustice bruised her daily. Not once did she name herself victim. Not once did she ask for sympathy. She only asked to be remembered truly, not as mad, not as divine, but as whole, as real, as Juana. And in the end, that is how she remained, Not lost, not myth, not warning, but a woman who stood too long alone, and in doing so made space for others. They now teach her in halls of history, not just in footnotes, but in full chapters. Young scholars argue over her letters, over her silences, over her final years, and every time her name is spoken anew, another layer of forgetting falls away. Some names endure through force and empire. Others, like Juana's, endure through quiet truth, through breath held, through eyes that do not close. Her name is no longer only history. It has become a mirror, a lesson, and most of all, a presence. Juana of Castile, not only queen, not only captive, but the woman who endured silence and turned it into testimony. The dust on her portrait had thickened again, not from time alone, but from neglect. For even memory, if not nurtured, dims slowly. Juana's image sat in a quiet corridor. No fanfare, no candle lit beneath her name. But silence had always suited her legacy. She had been sculpted not in stone, but in resistance carved through breath and waiting. Other queens smiled from canvases in gold. Juana's gaze did not soften, nor turn away. It stared back, steady, unblinking, asking simply, why? Why must grief be called madness? Why must loyalty be treated like threat? Why must a woman's love condemn her? She had not asked for a kingdom. She had asked only to remain whole. But history often fears what it cannot define, and Juana had never been simple. Never a pawn, nor a saint. She was something more dangerous. A woman who remembered too clearly. Memory for her was not a wound. It was armor polished in solitude. When they took her voice, she listened more sharply. When they closed the gates, she watched what passed through. Even locked doors do not stop vision. Even silence cannot unlearn what's known. She once touched the edge of empire. Now, she stood at the edge of truth, not shouting, just enduring steadily without retreat. Her children became kings, strangers, then rumors. Each bore her blood, but not her name. They ruled with laws. She ruled with echoes. In letters never sent, she wrote, "I am still here, despite the world's forgetting." And indeed she was. Still in the creak of convent steps, still in the hush of marble halls, still in the soil where she once walked. The place that confined her also bore witness to her stillness. One nun, decades later, confessed this. Her silence was heavier than any sermon. That silence held questions none dared answer. It carried the shape of what was stolen, a life cut to fit someone else's script. Yet Juana refused to disappear entirely. Even when erased from ceremony and page, she persisted in spaces history overlooks, in the tremble of another caged queen, in the ache of a woman misread, in the face of one who waits unthanked. That was Juana's true inheritance, a space made for those unheard, not carved in granite, but passed in quiet recognition. When you are told you are too much, too feeling, too loyal, too difficult, Juana waits beside you in silence. Not to speak for you, but to remind you you are not alone. They once called her mad with grief. Yet she outlived the kings who named her. She outlasted the advisors who silenced her. She died in confinement, but her story broke the walls. Walls crack not from violence, but from a voice that never stops echoing, and Juana's voice never ceased, even when her lips closed. They buried her beside the man she loved, Philip, whose betrayal wrote her exile. Still, she had asked to lie near him. Some saw that as madness. But love, for Juana, was never simple. It had burned her, yes, but it had also shaped her heart. She did not love for reward. She loved because it was true, even when that truth wounded her deeply, even when it cost her everything. Juana never apologized for feeling fully. That, more than anything, unsettled her world. A woman who mourned aloud. A queen who did not forget. A mother who grieved in public. And yet, beneath all of that, she remained sovereign over her sorrow. She chose her silence deliberately. She held her memory like a relic, and in doing so she transformed both. Now, historians write of her again, not as fable nor warning, but fact. Her life re-examined, her mind no longer dismissed. And in those papers, another revolution stirs, not of weapons, but of witness. Juana becomes more than symbol. She becomes a question. What happens when truth is inconvenient? What happens when a woman does not bend? When she refuses to forget, refuses to accept the story she's given. Juana did not scream her way into legend. She breathed there, calm, slow, immovable. And that breath, sustained through centuries, is what keeps her name from vanishing. In a world that praises forgetting, she taught us how to remember. In a court that feared tears, she wept with courage. In a history that flattened women, she stood unflattened. Her face now appears in exhibits and lectures. Scholars argue not her worth, but her truth. She does not need defense. She needs no revision. She was always whole, always complex, always true. They simply took centuries to see it. But Juana never needed permission to exist. She had existed fully without it, and now her story remains, not through inheritance, but through insistence. Juana of Castile, Queen of Sorrow and Stillness, patron saint of the misread and misunderstood. She is not gone. She is only more visible now, and in that visibility, she is finally free. They called her queen, yet gave her no crown. They feared her voice, yet copied her silence. She lived behind doors, but never disappeared. Juana's name became a kind of echo, not loud, not soft, but impossibly steady. She was not born to be still. Yet stillness became her most defiant act. Not resignation, not surrender, something more powerful. Presence. When they closed the gates around her, they believed they'd ended her story there. But walls do not silence what breath remembers. And Juana remembered everything. She remembered the scent of Castilian pine, the weight of velvet draped across her shoulders, the press of her father's farewell hand, the pause before her mother said, "Queen," all of it stitched into her soul. Nothing was lost, only layered more deeply. Years passed without ceremony or applause. Her birthdays came and went unmarked. The world turned without waiting for her. And yet she waited with unwavering grace. Grace not born of tradition, but carved from the refusal to vanish. The guards changed faces. The prayers changed tongues. But Juana remained. She still lit her own candles. She still folded each letter thrice. She still bowed her head before sleep. Not in defeat, but in quiet devotion. They said she was mad, but they mistook memory for madness. They mistook sorrow for sickness. They mistook strength for instability. What frightened them was not confusion. It was her clarity. It was how she saw everything too sharply, how she named the grief they hid. She did not pretend to forget. She did not perform happiness. And that, to a court of masks, was the most dangerous trait of all. Her son became emperor of distant lands. He sat on thrones built by oceans, but even he could not escape her shadow. He rarely spoke of her aloud, yet each time he wrote sovereign, he unknowingly summoned her name. For Juana had taught him something, not with words, but with absence. That power without love is thin, that silence can outlive empire. She had given him life and rule. He had given her walls and distance. Still, she never renounced him. She simply remained what she always was: mother, queen, witness. One winter, a sister wrote to her. The letter came folded in soft linen. It spoke of snow in the northern hills, of old songs sung in empty halls. Juana read it slowly, lips barely moving, then placed it near the window's edge, so the sun could warm its corners. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Some messages were not for reply, only for remembering. Even in isolation, she remained connected, not by roads or servants, but by memory's long, invisible thread. The walls around her grew moss. Paint flaked. Locks rusted, but she remained intact. A woman who had known loss, but never allowed it to unmake her. One of the nuns grew ill. Juana visited her without being asked. She sat beside the bed in silence, then said gently, "You are not alone." The nun cried softly, not from fear, but from understanding. Juana knew what it meant to sit beside an ending, to be present without needing to speak. That had always been her strength, to endure without demanding attention, to witness pain without turning away. In her final decade, she moved slower, but each step was still deliberate. She wore no crown, no rings, but carried more weight than any jewels. Dignity for Juana was not decor. It was rhythm, posture, still breath. Some days she stood at her window for hours without blinking or shifting. She wasn't waiting. She was remembering. And in that stillness, a strange kind of authority returned. Not the authority of decree or power, but the quiet authority of a soul that has survived what others couldn't name. Visitors came and went in court. Her name was whispered, then forgotten again. But history cannot hold its breath forever. And in every forgetting, there lies the seed of return. Juana's return came slowly through pages, through the eyes of those who reread her. Not as monarch, but as mirror. Not as figure of failure, but as the keeper of truth unspoken. Because truth often hides in the quietest rooms. And Juana had lived in those rooms. When they wrote her name beside insane, they meant to close the book. But her story began where theirs stopped. She lived beyond their sentences, beyond their judgments and simplifications, not because she defied them, but because she endured them without vanishing. Now her image hangs in fewer places, but those who see it look longer, not for answers, but for understanding. And in that gaze, she lives again, not as victim, not as mad queen, but as a woman who held her breath through generations of forgetting and never let it go. What remains of a queen once silenced? Not jewels, not banners, not carved thrones, but breath held across centuries of forgetting. Juana had no tomb with golden letters, no feast day, no statues raised in squares. She had only the long memory of silence, a silence so full it began to speak. And when it spoke, it did not shout. It murmured through walls and parchment edges, through half-forgotten prayers in empty chapels. Her legacy was not in power held, but in power endured, power denied, and lived. Many women came after her in history. Few were told the truth about Juana. Some heard of her madness, others of her confinement and grief. But the deepest part remained untouched. Her unwillingness to vanish without meaning. She had learned early what it cost to live with both memory and title. She wore both until the end. In her youth, they said she was passionate. In her middle years, they called her unstable. In old age, they called her forgotten. But through it all, she remained constant. Not in mind, perhaps, but in spirit. Spirit cannot be sealed in a room. Spirit walks through stone, breathes through cracks. And Juana had walked more than once through histories that tried to exclude her. They tried to name her with fear, but fear was never her own. She feared no man, only forgetting, and that fear made her dangerous. Not because she raised armies, but because she could not be erased. There were years she said nothing. Not because she was broken, but because no one listened truly. Words, like crowns, are meaningless without witness. So she became her own witness. She watched herself survive beyond explanation, and in that survival, she reclaimed her name, not from madness, not from myth, but from time itself. The candle she lit each night burned lower with the seasons, but it never went out entirely. One nun kept it after Juana's passing. She said, "The light did not belong to walls," and placed it by her own bed. That flame became a secret torch, passed quietly from hand to hand. Not a relic, but a reminder that some women speak without needing sound, that presence can be louder than history. Juana was not the only one silenced, but she was among the first to endure so completely, so deliberately, so clearly. She was not the kind of queen who left behind conquest or decree, but she left behind something more enduring. A lesson in presence, a lesson in patience, a lesson in what it means to remain when all are telling you to disappear. Even now, her story shifts in shadow. Some still call her unstable, but fewer believe it now. And those who look closer understand. It was not her grief that unraveled her. It was the world's refusal to hold it. She carried what others discarded. She felt what others buried. She remembered what others wanted lost. And she paid the price for it, not with failure, but with invisibility. But even invisibility is a kind of power. The kind that waits, the kind that watches, the kind that returns when needed. And Juana has returned, not to rule, but to remind. That stillness is not weakness, that tears are not madness, that silence, when chosen, is a form of control. They read her letters now in archives, some written with trembling hand, others steady. Each carries a weight beneath the words, a sense that she knew more than they thought. And she did. She knew the cost of being a woman in a world that feared depth. She knew what it meant to be loved only when quiet, only when useful, only when pleasing. And she refused to remain within that script. She broke it, not loudly, but completely. Now her name returns in other ways. In novels, in lectures, in quiet nods, across dinner tables where women remember. Remember what it feels like to be unheard, unheeded, unheld. But Juana holds them now, not as savior, but as companion. She walks beside those who wait, who sit in rooms wondering if they matter. She answers without words. You do, I did, we endure. That is her throne now. Not marble, but memory. Not golden, but enduring. And no one can take it from her, because thrones fall. But truth, once seen, remains. Juana of Castile remains. Not only in books or bloodlines, but in every moment someone is told they are too much to be understood. Too feeling, too faithful, too fierce. She rises in those moments, unseen. Not to correct, but to accompany. Not to reign, but to witness. And that witnessing, across centuries, is the most lasting power of all. Even centuries later, her silence lingers like breath. Not vanished, only folded into deeper memory. Juana does not haunt the halls of kings. She is not a ghost trapped by injustice. She is a presence, quiet, weighty, undeniable. Her footsteps no longer echo on stone. But her story travels where history left gaps. She does not cry out from paintings. She waits in the blank space between lines, between what was written and what was meant. They once said her grief was endless, but it was her clarity that endured longest. Even in darkness, she never lost her shape. Even alone, she did not lose her name. In every retelling, her outline shifts slightly. Some see madness, some see martyrdom, but those who look slowly see more. A woman who could not be simplified, a soul not made for neat categories. She lived in too many contradictions, faithful yet feared, royal yet confined, grieving yet strong beyond measure. And in those contradictions, she became legend, not through myth, but through memory sustained. One winter evening, a young scribe visited. He came not to judge, but to listen. Juana did not speak for hours. She simply watched him with patient stillness. Then she asked, "Why do you study me?" He answered, "Because they say you were broken." She smiled, not bitter, not sad, just knowing, and said, "Then write that I was whole." Those were the last words he recorded. He left changed, though unsure why exactly. Some truths do not strike. They settle slowly. Juana's truth was one of those. She was not loud, but lasting. Not glorious, but grounded. Her greatness came not from conquest, but from refusing to become less. She lost everything they could take from her. Titles, freedom, even the warmth of children. But what she kept was never theirs, her will, her memory, her quiet defiance. And that quiet carried further than crowns. There are churches where her name was erased, but the stones still remember her steps. There are ledgers that omit her signature, but her breath lingers where they lied. You cannot fully remove what endured honestly. They can reshape the narrative again and again, but Juana's truth resists every retelling. She is not a fable to pity. She is a presence that reminds us some lives are not measured by rulership, but by how long they outlast dismissal. She had been called wife, mother, captive, queen, but none of those words held her completely. She was Juana, entire, incomplete, enduring. The world has always punished women who feel, and Juana felt everything without apology. That was her rebellion, grief without permission, memory without edit, devotion without reward. And still they tried to make her myth, tried to reduce her to symbols and shame. But symbols do not pray by candlelight. Myths do not fold letters in shaking hands. She was never less than real. And in her reality, she became immortal, even when no one wrote of her. She lived in the silence between names. Even when forgotten by courts and records, she remained with those who carry invisible weight. Women who love too deeply and wait too long. Women whose names vanish in their own lifetimes. Women who sit in locked rooms and endure. She is theirs and they are hers, not as heroine, not as saint, but as quiet companion in the dark. Juana never asked for followers or forgiveness. She asked only to be known fully, not praised, not corrected, simply known. And that request, ignored in life, is now being honored, one reader at a time. You too have joined that witnessing. By reading, by remembering, you restore her. Not to a throne, but to her place in truth. She no longer needs history's permission to exist. She lives now beyond its reach, in the mind that pauses over her name, in the voice that refuses to repeat old lies, in the silence that recognizes its kin. She is not waiting anymore. She is simply present. That is what remembering can do. It raises what time tried to lower. It gathers the broken and gives them shape. It offers what history never does freely, a place to remain without distortion. Juana of Castile remains, not only in lineage, but in spirit. Not as monarch, but as mirror. She teaches us that survival is not small, that feeling deeply is not weakness, that silence can speak louder than rule, and that a woman who endures unseen is never truly alone again. Time no longer moved in straight lines for her. It circled back, lingered, repeated, whispered through memory. Some days she woke unsure of the season, but she always remembered the sound of betrayal. Voices change with age, but silence stays familiar. And silence was what had shaped her most. It taught her how to endure injustice quietly, how to survive not through resistance, but absorption. She absorbed years, rumors, prayers, and forgetting, and in return gave nothing that wasn't chosen. That was her final control, to remain intact even when all else was taken away. A court can name a queen, but only she can name herself. And Juana named herself in stillness, in breath held, in memory preserved. Those who dismissed her never truly knew her. They feared her sorrow, not her strength. A woman who remembers is a dangerous thing. She sees what others deny and endure. They called her unfit because she grieved openly, because her tears were not rehearsed for sympathy. But her grief was not madness. It was truth that refused to dim. And truth, in a world of performance, is often punished before it's understood. So they locked her away, quietly and thoroughly, assuming silence would do what swords could not. But Juana was never made of fear. She was made of history's deepest fiber. She remembered the weight of her mother's crown, the cold distance of her father's politics, the way her husband's warmth turned quickly cold. And she carried all of it with grace, grace not given by titles or priests, but grace grown through private ruin and repair. Her body aged behind thick stone walls, her hair thinned, her eyes slowed, her steps shortened. But nothing about her disappeared completely. Inside her chest, the ember remained. Not fire, not fury, just steady presence. She no longer asked for justice or vindication. She asked only that her name remain whole. Not decorated, not pitied, just unbroken. And with time, her name began to mend. Women read of her and paused longer, not at her title, but at her silence. not at her madness, but her memory. They saw themselves in her endurance, and in seeing her, they saw more clearly, not just Juana's life, but their own reflected. What does it mean to be contained? To have feeling punished? Presence restrained? Juana never asked those questions aloud. She lived them, line by line, breath by breath, and each woman who listened heard her answer. You are not too much. You are not lost. You are not alone. Even now, her voice is soft but persistent, not spoken through lips, but through recognition, through every daughter told to quiet herself, through every widow who wept beyond permission, through every soul who sat in long waiting. Juana's legacy is not in royal decree. It lives in the hands of the forgotten, in the rooms where names are spoken gently, in the spaces where grief is not shamed. There is no monument tall enough for her, no crown wide enough for her endurance, but there is a hush that honors her, a pause, a stillness, a deeper breath taken, and in that breath she lives again. The nuns who walked beside her last days said she became more quiet than ever, but never distant, never dull. She smiled at flowers brought from gardens. She blessed bread with soft, cracked fingers. She listened to birds as if in prayer. When one sister died in the night, Juana sat beside the body until dawn. She did not cry. She simply watched, not as ruler, not as prisoner, as someone who understood what it meant to leave without being fully seen. That was always Juana's greatest sorrow. Not exile, but erasure. Not being hated, but being misnamed. Yet even misnamed, she remained herself. Even distorted, she stayed real. Because the truth she held was never given by others. It came from within, and it stayed there, untouched. Now, those who walk where she once stood often pause without knowing why. They feel something unspoken press gently near. That is how she survives now. Not in bloodlines, not in monuments, but in recognition that passes without sound, in women who turn pages and see themselves, not queens, not captives, but presences misunderstood and still enduring. If Juana had asked for anything final, it would not have been pity or apology. It would have been this: do not let them simplify me. And we haven't, not anymore. We speak her name with precision now, not to worship, but to witness. And in that witnessing, she stands taller than any crown allowed. Juana of Castile, named mad, lived wise, died whole. Remember her not for her fall, but for her refusal to disappear. This is where her story finds its stillness, not its end, only a quiet resting point. Juana no longer waits behind stone and gate. She walks now in the space between memory, not confined by walls nor broken by silence, but carried forward by those who remember gently. The world she knew is long gone now. The thrones changed hands, the crowns dimmed, but her presence remains, more vivid than any statue, because she was never made of ceremony. She was made of sorrow and survival intertwined. History often prefers queens who smile politely, who rule briefly and leave no questions behind. But Juana left questions that still remain open, not for answers, but for reflection and reckoning. What do we do with women like her? Women who feel deeply and refuse disguise, women who break without ever falling apart. Her legacy cannot be held in glass. It lives best in breath and knowing glances, in the slow nod of someone who understands, in the eyes of a girl who resists, in the hands of a widow who remembers. She gave them no kingdom, but gave them language. A language built from waiting, from dignity, from truth, one that asks nothing but to be known. In the last letter ever found in her hand, the ink faint, the lines uneven with age, she wrote just a single sentence: I remained as I was through everything. And she did. She remained, despite time, despite titles stripped, despite betrayal, revision, omission, and misunderstanding. She remained as Juana, whole, quiet, unyielding, not without pain. There was always pain, but not undone by it. That, perhaps, is the heart of her story. She was never undone. Not by death, not by exile, not by myth. They tried to remove her from legacy, but she became something deeper than legacy. A presence known not by power, but by the refusal to vanish quietly. And that is a power history cannot bury. In cathedrals where kings lie gilded and grand, Juana's name is not carved in stone. But speak softly, and you'll still hear her. In the wind between stained glass shadows. In the echo beneath unspoken prayers. Not as ghost, as presence. She walks with those still unheard today. She keeps pace beside the misunderstood. And when they feel alone, she leans close without words. Because she knows. She always knew what it was to wait without answer. To speak and be misnamed for it. To stay alive without approval or reward. That is where her crown was made. Not from gold, but from memory unbroken. And in that crown, she continues, the story ends not in her death, but in our remembering. Each time we choose to look again, to question, to honor, to feel, we keep her near. Not for who they said she was, but for who she truly remained. A daughter who outlived her inheritance. A wife who buried her loyalty too deeply. A mother who loved with unreachable devotion. A queen who reigned only in silence, but ruled every room that misread her. They gave her madness when she asked for mercy. They gave her chains when she gave them love. They gave her darkness, and she made it light. That is the shape of her legacy. Not grand, not loud, but eternal. And in that, Juana lives still. Not waiting to be rescued, not asking to be rewritten. Just walking beside those who carry more than they can speak. Her life is no longer only hers, it belongs now to all who've been called too much, too soft, too strange, too quiet. To all who've felt themselves locked away, not in prisons, but in perception. Juana holds their hands now, unseen, and when the world grows too loud to bear, her silence offers shelter without judgment. That is the ending she wrote for herself. Not in ink, but in presence. And that presence, once ignored, is finally honored. Juana of Castile, daughter of kingdoms, prisoner of politics, witness to centuries. She is remembered, she is restored, she is free. Now the story draws to its final breath. Not with triumph nor tragedy, but quiet clarity. Juana of Castile, long misunderstood, has spoken again through these patient pages. She did not ask for our pity. She asked only to be seen whole, not edited, not softened, not simplified, but remembered in her full, enduring truth. A woman made of presence, not performance. A queen without a throne, yet never voiceless. Her voice, though silenced, became a rhythm. It beat beneath stone, beneath history's forgetting. And now that rhythm reaches us again. Through you, who paused long enough to read, to feel, to wonder. That is how she lives now, not in empire, but in echo. Every breath you took in reflection, every silence that settled as you listened. You carried her forward. You did what centuries refused to do. You stayed beside her. You saw her. And in seeing her, you honored something larger. All those who wait quietly in shadows. This story may end on this final line, but Juana's voice does not end here. It walks with you now. In each moment you are told to hush. In each grief no one understands but you. In each truth that trembles without audience. She is there. Not above you, but beside you. As companion, as witness, as quiet fire. And that is the most lasting crown a woman can wear.